"You're too old to stay here anymore," my son said, his voice calm, almost casual, like he was commenting on the weather instead of rewriting the rest of my life. I didn't respond right away. I just sat there at the dining table I had polished every Sunday for over 30 years, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the wood, feeling the faint grooves and scratches that held the memory of every family dinner we had ever shared. The room felt different that night. Not louder, not quieter, just colder. I looked at Daniel across from me, really looked at him, noticing how easily he avoided my eyes, how his attention drifted back to his wife, Lauren, who sat beside him with her back straight and her lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't have to. The silence between them spoke clearly enough. I had seen that look before, though I hadn't understood it then. Not fully. "It's not safe for you to be here alone anymore," Daniel added, as if that softened the blow, as if dressing it up in concern made it something other than what it was. I nodded slowly, letting his words settle into place, like pieces of a puzzle I had been assembling without realizing it. The past few weeks suddenly rearranged themselves in my mind. The quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The paperwork left half hidden on the kitchen counter. The way Lauren had started referring to the house as the property instead of home. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate, careful, deliberate. My movements didn't match the weight of what had just been said, and maybe that was the point. I wasn't going to give them what they expected. Not tonight. "If that's what you think is best," I said softly. My voice didn't shake. It surprised even me. Daniel exhaled, relieved, like a man who had just finished a difficult task and was grateful it hadn't turned into a scene. Lauren's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. They had been preparing for resistance, for tears, for pleading. But I had learned something over the years, something my late husband used to say when things got complicated. Silence reveals more than anger ever could. I glanced around the dining room, taking in the familiar details. The framed photographs along the wall. Daniel as a boy, grinning with missing teeth. My husband standing beside me in the backyard, his arm wrapped around my shoulders. Every inch of this house had been built on years of sacrifice, of careful planning, of love that had once felt unshakable. And now, I was being told I no longer belonged here. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had become inconvenient. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my sweater as if this were just another ordinary evening coming to an end. "I'll start packing in the morning," I said. Daniel nodded again, too quickly this time, as if he wanted to move past this moment before it could change shape. Lauren offered a small smile, the kind people give when they believe everything has gone according to plan. I returned it, just as small, just as controlled. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that this conversation hadn't begun tonight, and it certainly wouldn't in the way they imagined. I turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving them behind at the table, still thinking they had already won. I did not pack that night. Instead, I went upstairs and closed the bedroom door quietly behind me, the same way I had done for decades, so I would not wake my husband when he used to fall asleep early with a book in his hands. The room still carried traces of him, faint but steady, like a memory that refused to fade. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand. His sweater still hung on the back of the chair. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, and then I walked to the closet and reached for the small wooden box he had given me years ago. It was nothing special to anyone else, just a simple box with a brass latch, but I had kept it exactly where he told me to, untouched, waiting. My fingers did not hesitate as I opened it. Inside were the documents I had reviewed only once before, on a quiet afternoon when he had insisted I sit down and listen carefully. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I understood. I lifted the papers slowly, scanning the familiar lines, the signatures, the dates. Everything was still exactly as it had been written. Nothing had changed. Downstairs, I could hear the faint murmur of Daniel and Lauren talking, their voices low but relaxed, as if the hardest part of their evening was already behind them. I imagined them clearing the dishes, moving through the kitchen that I had organized down to the last drawer, already picturing what they would change, what they would make their own. I folded the documents carefully and placed them back into the box, closing the latch with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, not moving, not rushing. There was no need. The truth had a way of unfolding at its own pace, and I had learned not to interfere with that. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, just as I always had. The house was still, wrapped in that early morning calm that used to feel comforting. I made coffee the same way I had every day for years, measuring it carefully, letting the familiar routine guide me. When Daniel walked into the kitchen, he looked surprised to see me already dressed, already moving through the space like nothing had changed. "You did not have to rush," he said, reaching for a mug. "We can figure things out over the next couple of weeks." I nodded, pouring myself a cup. "Of course," I replied. "There is no need to rush." My voice was steady, almost gentle. He seemed relieved again, the tension easing from his shoulders as he leaned against the counter. Lauren entered a moment later, her eyes briefly scanning the room, as if checking for signs of resistance, of disruption. She found none. I moved past them both, carrying my coffee into the living room, where the morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and quiet. I sat down in my usual chair and looked around, taking in every detail, every corner, every memory. They believed this was the beginning of my departure. What they did not understand was that everything had already been set in motion long before that dinner. And now, all I had to do was let them continue exactly as they were. By the third day, the house no longer felt like mine, but I continued moving through it as if it still was, careful, steady, unchanged on the surface. I did not pack in a hurry. I chose one drawer at a time, one shelf at a time, folding my clothes with the same precision I had always used, placing them neatly into boxes I had brought down from the attic myself. Daniel noticed, of course. He stood in the doorway of my bedroom that afternoon, watching me for a moment before speaking. "You really do not have to do all this yourself," he said, his tone almost kind, as if kindness could erase what had already been decided. "We can hire movers." I shook my head gently, smoothing a sweater before placing it into the box. "I prefer to handle my own things," I replied. He nodded, lingering a second longer than necessary, as if he wanted to say something else but could not find the words. Then he left. Lauren, on the other hand, did not linger. She had begun making changes already, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. The framed photos in the hallway shifted positions. The small ceramic bowl I kept by the front door disappeared one morning and was replaced with something newer, sharper, less familiar. She moved through the house with quiet authority, measuring spaces with her eyes, speaking in low tones on her phone about paint colors and furniture arrangements. Once, as I passed the kitchen, I heard her say, "It will feel completely different once we clear everything out." She lowered her voice when she noticed me, offering a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. I returned it just the same. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the same seat I had taken for years, while Daniel and Lauren stood by the counter discussing something in hushed voices. They did not include me. They did not need to. I had already been moved, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. Still, I listened. Not openly, not obviously, but enough. Enough to understand the direction they were heading, the assumptions they were making. They spoke about timelines, about renovations, about how soon everything could be finalized. They spoke as if the outcome was already guaranteed. I lowered my eyes to the surface of the table, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertips, remembering the day we had chosen it together, my husband and I, standing side by side in a small furniture store, debating between two finishes as if it were the most important decision in the world. To us, it had been. To them, it was just another item on a list. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet again, I carried another box downstairs and set it by the front door. I paused there, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and looked out through the glass at the darkened street beyond. Nothing had changed outside. The same streetlights, the same quiet neighborhood, the same stillness. Inside, everything was shifting, piece by piece, but not in the way they believed. I turned back toward the staircase, my steps slow, deliberate. There was no need to rush the process. They were building their future on an assumption. And assumptions, I had learned, have a way of unraveling when the truth is finally revealed. The memory did not come all at once. It arrived in fragments, quiet and persistent, like the ticking of a clock you only notice when everything else goes still. On the fourth morning, as I wrapped another set of dishes in newspaper, I found myself thinking about the day we first walked into this house, long before it became what it is now. Back then, the walls were bare, the floors unfinished, and the air smelled faintly of fresh paint and possibility. My husband had stood in the doorway, his hand resting at the small of my back, and said, "We will make this ours, one piece at a time." And we did. Every corner of this place held a decision we had made together. The kitchen cabinets we installed ourselves over a long summer weekend. The garden out back that started with a single row of roses and slowly grew into something that neighbors would stop to admire. The dining table where birthdays were celebrated, where holidays stretched late into the night, where Daniel once sat as a boy, swinging his legs. Beneath the chair, asking questions about everything he did not yet understand. I folded another plate into paper, my hand steady, though my thoughts were far from it. It was strange, the way memories could feel so close and yet so distant at the same time. I could still hear my husband's voice clearly, could still picture the way he would pause before speaking when he wanted to make sure his words mattered. There had been one evening, not long before he passed, when he asked me to sit down with him at this very table. He had a folder in his hands, his expression calm but serious. "There are things you need to know," he said. I remember brushing it off at first, telling him not to worry, that we had plenty of time. He did not argue. He simply waited until I sat down, until I listened. That was his way. He never raised his voice. He never forced a moment. But when something mattered, he made sure it stayed with you. I blinked and returned to the present, placing the wrapped dishes carefully into a box. Downstairs, I could hear movement again, drawers opening and closing, footsteps that did not belong to me. The house no longer echoed with familiarity. It echoed with change. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside for a moment, standing on the back porch and looking out at the garden. The roses were still there, blooming quietly, just as they had every year. I had trimmed them myself only a few weeks ago, before everything shifted, before the conversations began to carry a different tone. I walked along the narrow path, brushing my fingers lightly against the petals, remembering how proud he had been when the first flowers bloomed. "You see," he had said with a smile, "good things take time, but they last." I stood there longer than I intended, letting the sunlight settle against my shoulders, letting the quiet surround me. Inside the house, they were planning a future that did not include me. Outside, everything remained exactly as it had always been. I turned back toward the door slowly, my steps measured, my expression unchanged. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. And now, piece by piece, it was beginning to remind me exactly what had been put in place long before anyone thought to take it away. It was not a single moment that revealed the truth to me. It was a series of small things, almost invisible on their own, but impossible to ignore once they began to connect. On the fifth day, I was in the hallway carrying a box when I noticed the study door slightly ajar. That room had always been my husband's space, the one place in the house where everything remained exactly as he left it. Daniel rarely went in there before. He said it felt too heavy, too quiet. But now, the door was open, and I could hear voices inside. I did not stop walking. I did not need to. The words carried clearly enough. "We should list it as soon as possible," Lauren said, her voice low but firm. "The market is good right now, and we can get a strong offer if we move quickly." There was a pause, and then Daniel replied, quieter, uncertain. "We should wait until she is settled somewhere else." "Why?" Lauren asked, sharper this time. "It is not like she has a say in it anymore." I kept walking, my steps steady, my expression unchanged, but something inside me shifted into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was never about concern. It was never about safety. It was about control, about timing, about removing me just long enough to make everything else easier. I carried the box into the living room and set it down carefully, adjusting the edges as if it mattered how straight they were. In that moment, every small detail from the past few weeks resurfaced with new meaning. The questions about paperwork, the sudden interest in property taxes, the way Lauren had once asked, almost casually, if there were any outstanding documents they should be aware of. At the time, I had answered simply, without suspicion. Now, I understood the intention behind the question. That evening, Daniel approached me while I was folding another set of linens. He leaned against the doorframe, his posture hesitant, as if he were trying to find the right way to say something that had already been decided. "Lauren and I have been looking at a few places for you," he said. "There is a nice community about 20 miles from here. Quiet. Safe. They have activities and everything." I nodded, smoothing the fabric in my hands. "That sounds thoughtful," I replied. He seemed relieved again, mistaking my calm for agreement, for surrender. "We just want what is best for you," he added, his voice softening. I looked up at him then, meeting his eyes fully for the first time in days. There was something unfamiliar there, something distant, as if the boy I once knew had been replaced by someone who believed his own reasoning without question. "Of course you do," I said gently. He smiled, reassured, and stepped away, already moving on to whatever came next. I finished folding the linens and placed them neatly into the box, closing the lid with quiet precision. They believed they were guiding the situation, shaping it to fit their plans. They believed I had not noticed the shift, the strategy, the quiet urgency behind their decisions. But I had. And more importantly, I knew something they did not. The foundation they were building on was not as solid as they thought. It never had been. And soon enough, they would understand exactly what they had overlooked. The call came the next morning, just as I was finishing my coffee, the cup still warm in my hands as I sat by the window watching the early light stretch across the quiet street. I recognized the number immediately, though it had been years since I had last seen it appear on my phone. I answered without hesitation. "Margaret," the voice on the other end said, steady and familiar. "I was wondering when you might reach out." I allowed myself a small pause before responding. "Good morning, Mr. Harris," I said. "I believe it is time." There was no need to explain further. He understood. He had always understood more than he said, which was precisely why my husband trusted him. We arranged to meet that afternoon, a simple appointment, nothing that would raise questions if anyone happened to ask. I moved through the rest of the morning as I had the days before, folding, sorting, placing things into boxes with quiet precision. Daniel left for work just before 9, offering a brief nod as he passed through the kitchen. Lauren stayed behind, speaking on her phone again, her voice drifting through the hallway as she discussed timelines and possibilities with someone on the other end. Neither of them asked where I was going when I picked up my purse and headed for the door. That, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. They believed I was exactly where they needed me to be. The drive into town took about 20 minutes, the same route I had taken countless times over the years, though it felt different now, sharper somehow, as if every turn carried a quiet significance. When I arrived, Mr. Harris was already waiting, standing just inside the doorway of his office, his expression calm but attentive. He greeted me with a firm handshake and led me inside without unnecessary words. The office had not changed. The same polished desk, the same framed certificates along the wall, the same sense of order that made everything feel exactly as it should be. I sat across from him and placed my hands neatly in my lap, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I assume things have progressed," he said. I nodded once. "They have made their intentions clear." He studied me for a moment, not with concern, but with a kind of measured understanding. "And you are ready to proceed?" I allowed myself a faint smile, the kind that does not need to be explained. "I have been ready for some time." He reached for a folder on his desk, opening it with careful precision, revealing documents I recognized instantly, though I had not seen them in years. "Your husband was very thorough," he said quietly. He wanted to ensure that everything was handled exactly as he intended, regardless of circumstances. I looked down at the papers, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, feeling a calm settle over me that I had not felt in days. "He always was," I replied. We went over the details slowly, methodically, each step unfolding exactly as it had been designed long before any of this began. There were no surprises, no uncertainty, only clarity. When the meeting ended, I stood and gathered my things, pausing briefly at the door. "They believe this is almost over," I said, more to myself than to him. Mr. Harris gave a small, knowing nod. "Then they are about to be very surprised." I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air cool and steady, and for the first time since that dinner, I felt something shift completely into place. The path ahead was no longer uncertain. It was simply a matter of timing, and I had always been very patient. When I returned home that afternoon, nothing appeared different on the surface, and that was exactly how I needed it to be, of extending the kitchen into the dining room. Daniel laughed at something Lauren said, a sound that felt unfamiliar in this space, lighter than it used to be, detached from the memories that once filled these walls. I finished my meal and carried my plate to the sink, rinsing it carefully, placing it in the rack with the same deliberate precision as always. Nothing about my movements suggested urgency. Nothing suggested resistance. Later that night, I closed the last box and sealed it with a strip of tape, pressing it down firmly along the edges. The room around me was nearly empty now, the walls bare where photographs had once hung, the shelves cleared of the small objects that had quietly marked the passing of years. It looked like a space waiting to be claimed by someone else. And in a way, it was. I sat on the edge of the bed one final time, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my gaze steady as I took in what remained. There was no sadness in the room, not anymore. Only clarity. Downstairs, I could hear movement again, the soft rhythm of footsteps, the murmur of voices that carried a sense of completion, of something nearly finished. They believed the transition was almost over. They believed I was stepping aside, leaving everything behind exactly as they intended. I stood up slowly and turned off the light, letting the room fall into darkness behind me as I stepped into the hallway. Tomorrow, I would leave this house. That part was true. But what they did not understand, what they had never questioned, was what would happen after I walked out that door. And by the time they realized it, there would be nothing. His hand. He looked up, surprised, as if he had expected this moment to feel different. "You are leaving early," he said. I nodded, reaching for my keys. "It is better this way," I replied. Lauren appeared a moment later, her expression composed, her posture relaxed, as if everything was unfolding exactly according to plan. "We will help you get settled," she said, her voice smooth, reassuring in a way that felt practiced. I offered a small smile. "That will not be necessary." There was a brief pause, just long enough for uncertainty to flicker across Daniel's face before it disappeared again. He glanced at Lauren, then back at me. "At least let us drive you," he added. "I appreciate it," I said gently, "but I have already made arrangements." That was true, just not the kind they were imagining. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, my steps steady, my shoulders relaxed, as if I were simply heading out for the day. Daniel followed me into the hallway, stopping a few feet behind as I reached for the handle. "Mom," he said, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. I turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes. For a moment, there was something there, something that almost resembled hesitation, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet conviction he had carried all week. "Take care of yourself," he added. I nodded once. "I always do." I stepped outside without looking back, closing the door behind me with a quiet, final click that echoed more loudly than any words could have. The air was cool, the morning still untouched by the noise of the day. My car was parked exactly where I had left it, waiting. I placed the boxes in the trunk one by one, careful, deliberate, then slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the house looked the same as it always had, unchanged, familiar, almost peaceful. From the outside, nothing had shifted, but inside, everything had already been set in motion. I drove away slowly, not out of reluctance, but out of certainty, letting the distance grow at its own pace. They would spend the day making plans, discussing next steps, believing the space was finally theirs to shape however they pleased. They would walk through each room, imagining what it would become, never once questioning what had already been decided long before they thought to claim it. By the time the call came, by the time they were asked to sit down and listen, it would be too late to adjust, too late to reconsider. Because this was never about leaving without anything. It was about leaving them with exactly what they believed they wanted, and nothing more. They received the call just after noon, at a time when everything still felt predictable, when the day had not yet revealed what it was going to become. I was not there to see it, but I could imagine it clearly. Daniel standing in the kitchen, his phone in hand, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something tighter, more focused, as the voice on the other end introduced itself. Mr. Harris did not waste time. He never did. He would have asked them to come down to the office, to sit, to listen carefully. Lauren would have insisted on going with him, of course. She always did when something involved decisions or control. And Daniel, still believing he was managing the situation, would have agreed without hesitation. By the time they arrived, everything would already be in place. The documents laid out. The details organized. The truth waiting quietly for its moment. I pictured them sitting across from that same polished desk, the same one I had faced just the day before, only now the roles were different. Now they were the ones being guided, being asked to follow, to understand. Mr. Harris would have explained it simply, clearly, without emotion. That the house was never transferred the way they believed. That the ownership had been secured under specific conditions long before my husband passed. That those conditions had now been activated. Lauren would have been the first to react. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with that sharp, controlled tone she used when something slipped beyond her reach. She would have asked questions, quick and precise, looking for gaps, for ways to redirect what she was hearing. There were none. Daniel, on the other hand, would have gone quiet. I knew that silence. It was the same one he had carried at the dinner table, the same one that came when reality did not align with expectation. He would have looked at the documents, reading and rereading the same lines, searching for something he had missed. And then, slowly, he would have understood. The house they had been planning to sell. The space they had already begun to reshape in their minds. It was not theirs to control. It never had been. By the time they left that office, the certainty they had carried all week would have been gone, replaced by something far less comfortable. I was sitting on a small bench overlooking a quiet lake when my phone buzzed in my hand. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. I let it ring once, twice, before answering. Mom. Daniel's voice came through, strained in a way I had not heard before. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Yes, I said calmly. There was a pause on his end, as if he was choosing his words carefully now, aware that something had shifted beyond his control. We need to talk, he said. I looked out across the water, the surface smooth, undisturbed, reflecting the sky above it. There is nothing left to discuss, I replied, my voice steady, almost gentle. Another pause, longer this time. I did not know, he added quietly. I believed him. That was the